Perennial plants are an important part of your food production system. Perennial plants are bushes, vines, and trees that you plant once and they continue to grow year after year. They require time and energy from you with little returns in the early years, but as they mature, they're easier and much less work than annuals. There are many resources available that focus on perennials that are edible and or useful. The Complete Book of Edible Landscaping by Rosalind Creasy and Perennial Vegetables by Eric Tosmeyer are two examples. Forest gardening or food forest are terms used to describe methods of food production based primarily on perennial plants. Robert Hart, a modern proponent of forest gardening, began to focus on perennials as he and his brother were getting on in age and needed systems that were less labor-intensive than annual vegetable gardening. An important point for all of us to consider. The biggest challenge with perennials is finding the right plants and locations for them so they will thrive and produce with the least amount of effort on your part. A house or other building creates different habitats called microclimates. The west side of the house tends to be hot and dry. Often a big deciduous tree is planted on the west side of the house so the house will be shaded in the summer and warmed in the winter. If you don't have a big tree for shading, then this is an area for those southwest desert plants like yuccas, cacti, or Mexican oregano. Mediterranean plants like olives, rosemary, and grapes can also work well. We have a small nursery on the east side of the house. The east side has that precious combination of morning sun, afternoon shade, and close proximity to your daily attention that will support more tender non-native plants. The southern area of our house has partial shade and is an edible lawn, which this summer we are growing watermelons, black-eyed peas, and assorted birdseed grasses. These are not perennials, but annuals that can reseed themselves year after year. Wild edibles such as plantains, lamb's quarters, and dewberries also show up in the lawn. The northern side of the house is an area for plants that like heavy shade. In addition to the plantings around the house, we are developing two perennial food areas, one in the post oak thicket and the other in the orchard or forest garden area. A hill also creates microclimates. If you recall, at this site, the barn is located on the top of a hill. So we chose the north side of the hill for our orchard, which we hope to evolve into a forest garden. The post oak thicket is a project where we are planting within an existing forested area. As the desired young trees grow, we slowly cut out the surrounding existing trees. Almost all plants require watering in the first year as they get their root systems established, and most will require ongoing watering and fertility beyond the first year to produce well. Forest gardening methods can ultimately develop food production systems that do not require irrigation after they have been matured, but those are very long-term projects, and they also require lots of water in the early stages. It sounds obvious, but make sure that you have your watering system set up before you plant. Most of the plants around your house can simply be watered via a hose. Of course, you can also set up automatic irrigation systems. In the post oak thicket plantings, we move a hose around to water planted trees. This area has lots of shade, and we have built berms behind the base of each tree to help capture and hold water. The leaf fall from surrounding trees also gets caught in the brush we've put in the berms. This creates a natural, almost effortless mulching system that also helps to retain water. Even in the heat of summer, we only need to water about once per month in here because of the shading, berms, and mulch. We found that watering once a month, dragging a hose to all the different trees here, was not that bad of a chore. There's only about a dozen of them that we irrigate in this area. The orchard is irrigated by a more complex irrigation system. The water is fed via gravity from the rainwater tanks up on the top of the hill. There are no pumps in the system, only valves to let the water flow or stop it. The main water line is a 2-inch diameter pipe. There are 4 levels of the orchard where we have 1-inch lateral lines. The dimension of piping in an irrigation system is critical. Get somebody knowledgeable in sizing if you're going to be running very large lines. In gravity-fed systems, the available water pressure is usually low. This mister is operating at about 8 psi right now. The first level in this orchard is just about 18 to 20 feet below the level of the water tanks when the water tanks are full. For gravity-fed systems, a key formula you need to know is that for every 10 feet of drop in height, you get 4.33 psi in water pressure. Most irrigation equipment expects at least 20 psi or more, which is a common household level. Even though they're not rated for this low of a pressure, just try several different varieties of misters and sprayers and you'll find one that will work well enough. In clay-based and loamy soils, drippers in the soil disperse water well. In sand, using drippers, we've realized the water just drops straight down, and we've switched to using misters as they spread the water over the root zone better. The great benefit to an irrigation system is that it saves a lot of time in watering. But be prepared. Once installed, the irrigation system will regularly still need maintenance. Drippers get plugged up, lines get cut or crimped, and hose connections leak. There are other methods to help retain water on your land. The 4 levels of the orchard are laid out to follow land contours, and the footpaths also travel along the irrigation lines on contour. As we walk on the paths on each level, the ground tends to get compacted on the paths. This hardens the ground along the levels, and this compaction tends to slow water down as it passes through the area. In other systems, people dig ditches on contour called swales that catch water, and it's a very effective technique. How much water do you need? As we discussed in the section on water, a general guideline is that most fruit and nut trees need at least an inch of rain a week. And an inch of rain translates into about 0.6 of a gallon per square foot. As the root system expands, you'll need to water more. In sandy soils, you'll need 2 to 3 times as much. During the heat of summer, we water trees once every 5 days. Just as in the garden, the key to healthy, productive perennials is the correct amount of fertility. And all of the methods discussed in the garden area are appropriate for fertilizing your perennials. In our orchard, we rely on 2 main sources for fertility: nitrogen-fixing plants and geese. Using nitrogen-fixing plants is appropriate for any size yard, and they should be used in every system. Using geese is only practical if you have at least a half an acre or more. Even if you don't have room for geese, it's a good example of how to integrate animals into your food production system. Nitrogen-fixing plants are the long-term key to fertility in the orchard. To review, the nitrogen fixers are plants that have a beneficial relationship with bacteria on their roots that allows them to get nitrogen from the air. Yes, a healthy soil should have some air down in it. Most of the nitrogen-fixing plants are in the legume family and come both as annuals and perennials. Planting annuals around your trees like peas and beans in the summer and clover and vetch in the winter help to increase the fertility of the area. You get the most nitrogen benefit if you cut them down and use them as mulch before they go to seed. In addition to annuals, we use a lot of nitrogen-fixing trees. Most of the nitrogen-fixing trees have other benefits than helping to build soil. They are often fast-growing, provide a nice dappled shade, and have edible leaves or pods. Here are some of the nitrogen-fixing trees we have in this orchard. You've met Lucena in the gardening section, and we use Lucena extensively in the orchard. There is information on propagating Lucena in the More Essentials section of this DVD, and written materials in the Documents section. This autumn olive is a small deciduous tree that fixes nitrogen and produces an edible berry. This one makes an excellent companion to this persimmon tree. Growing these trees together is a form of homemade fertilizer. Not only are the roots intermingling, but the extra leaf drop in the fall helps the persimmon. We're growing these honey locust trees with the intent that they will grow and become big canopy layer trees. The locusts are fast growing. This small seedling will become a big tree in just a few years. We planted this black locust only 3 years ago. It's done very well with almost no irrigation. If you noticed, it's planted in a ditch on contour. We are planting these honey locusts not only for their nitrogen-fixing properties, but especially for their long, sweet pods, which are similar to those on mesquite trees. Just like the mesquite beans, you can make a syrup or an intensely sweet flour from the pods. We have recipes available in the Documents section. We're especially interested in using the beans as a homemade sweet feed to keep our cows happy and interested during milking time. We have a lot more information available on nitrogen-fixing trees in the Documents section. Geese are a good complement to an orchard if you have room for them. We put fresh water into shallow tubs placed beneath our fruit trees. The geese love it, and they bathe and preen, copulate, and of course defecate in the water, making a good old mess, which is wonderful stuff for the fruit and nut trees. We rotate the tubs around the orchard and every tree gets this liquid fertilizer every 2 or 3 months. We found the Chinese geese are excellent egg layers, laying from approximately October to March here in central Texas. A goose egg is delicious and huge, equivalent to 3 or 4 chicken eggs. We collect and eat the eggs until about February, when the hens start setting to raise up a brood of new young goslings. Geese primarily eat grass and actually show disdain for grains unless there's nothing else available. They don't eat many broadleaf plants, but they do eat some. They do not eat bugs. They require shade in the summer, as everyone in Texas does, but no significant housing in the winter because they do have goose down. They need fresh drinking water every day. We use buckets gravity-fed from drums. These buckets simply need to be turned over each day to be emptied and then filled back up again with water from the drum. You should have 2 of these drinking water buckets for redundancy, and so you can slip off for a day if you need to. Goose meat is a dark, short-grained meat and is very tasty with no overly strong flavor. As with any livestock, goose is always better young, but we have eaten them several years old. Just boil the meat on a low heat for several hours and use in stews. Geese can fly a little bit, but it's more comical than practical. A 2 to 3 foot fence easily keeps them confined. Geese will need protection from predators. If you don't have a dog for protecting them, they can be trained to return to a pen each night. The fertility is the main reason we have the geese. Getting eggs, down, and feathers and meat is a real bonus. Filling up the water buckets and pans is a daily chore which can be skipped occasionally, but it's basically free fertilizer and is much easier than hauling in manure or compost from other sources, which we don't really have anyway. Finding the best species of tree for your site can be difficult. In southwest climates, the trees that are easiest to grow produce foods you probably aren't used to: mesquite beans, persimmons, jujubes, autumn olives, prickly pears, and yuccas. The majority of fruit and nut trees sold in nurseries and catalogs are grafted trees. That means the bottom part of the tree is from one plant, and the top part, which will bear fruit, is from another tree. Grafting ensures you get a known quality of fruit, like a Jonathan apple or a Granny Smith. Some seeds, like apples, produce highly variable trees, and you have no idea what the fruit will be like, and most often in apples, it is bitter and sour. We initially started out with all grafted trees because that is what is widely available, and those are the fruits that we were familiar with. But we rarely plant them anymore, and we do not recommend them. Most grafted trees are inherently weaker and shorter-lived than trees grown from seedlings. The fruit from native or well-adapted trees is not as familiar as the grafted trees, but in a lot of cases it really comes down to having any fruit is better than none. And when some of it escapes, you'll be helping your bioregion in providing good genetic material for food stocks for the area. There is a whole world of plants out there that produce edible or useful parts. Another resource to help you is a free online database of useful plants called Plants for a Future. Although the species we have growing here may or may not work in your area, we'll go on a quick tour of some of our trees to give you some ideas. These peach trees were some of our original plantings. They are all grafted trees on semi-dwarf rootstocks. In this region, it is typical to expect a good crop in peaches 1 out of 3 years. We are still trying to decide if the amount of fertility, water, and work is worth the effort. This June Gold here was our only producer this year. We got about 35 pounds of fruit from it, which if you check in your Grow Biointensive book, you'll see that that's at the low end of the possible yields. We're experimenting with these peach tree seedlings that we got from a friend. We're hoping that they'll produce a lot better with much less care. Some folks are very concerned about invasive species. In our opinion, if a plant produces something edible and useful or fixes nitrogen, then please invade us. This particular 5-leaf Acacia vine is probably a problem in other bioregions with higher rainfall. But here it has produced a delicious fruit within the first year with very little water and minimal care. If it starts getting out of control, we can use it for compost or check its edibility for livestock. These persimmon trees were planted 5 years ago, and they've produced for the last 2 years. Here in Texas, trees with thorns seem to do the best. These 2 jujube trees were planted 5 years ago. They have not yet started producing. We have planted several mulberry tree seedlings this winter. These trees grow quickly. Not only will the mulberries be good for us and the chickens, but the leaves are good forage for rabbits. We got this elderberry as a root sprout from a friend. It's only a year old and it sure wants to be here. These are pawpaws. These are East Texas natives. This plum was planted 5 years ago. Most of the blossoms this spring got killed by a late frost. This is a grafted tree. In the future, we will be planting some of the good native plum trees that are hardier and more productive. Acorn meal is delicious and makes great pancakes. We are tending these oak trees just for the acorn crop. For more information on how to use acorns and recipes, see the documents section. The best time for planting most trees in this region is in the fall. That way the trees can get a good start on their root systems long before the onslaught of summer. We find that trees that come in this size pot are the optimal size. They have a big enough root ball to get established, and yet they're still cost effective. Bare root trees seem to transplant just fine, but since most of them are grafted trees, we don't use them anymore. We have had losses as high as 90% of the trees planted at a time. Some of this was our own ignorance, and part is because this is a very difficult region to grow in. The good news is that as trees get older, they get stronger and are easier to maintain. Hopefully your losses won't be that high, but be prepared to have failures. Even native and well-adapted trees are going to need care for the first years to get established. When trees are young, they must be weeded, especially from grass. Some weeds bother trees and some weeds don't. We've seen lamb's quarters and grass essentially starve a young tree to death. These cowpen daisies and camphorweed do not seem to bother the trees at all. Learning these relationships is hard won. Mulch is extremely important in the summer months to help retain moisture. The absolute best mulch is wood chips, as their slow decomposition involves a fungal process that is also very beneficial to the tree. Wood chips are expensive and not easy to get, though. So if hay is what you got, use hay. Cut weeds, leaves, pine needles, corks, old cotton clothes, all those things also work. Our normal rain cycles are heavy 1 to 3 inch rains once or twice per month. Under those conditions, we like a thicker 4-inch mulch which absorbs and holds a lot of that moisture. During drought conditions, when rainfall comes in thinly 1/8 or 1/4 inch splatters, then our mulch is just a thin layer. Hopefully the size of your yard and your budget will limit you to only a few trees to start. Don't torture yourself with an acre. Talking with neighbors and maybe getting some seedlings from them is the best way to find good plants for your area. Befriend the folks at the native plant nursery nearest you. Other local nurseries and sometimes the county extension agents can be helpful. Set up your watering system before you start digging. Plant nitrogen-fixing plants at all levels first, the herbal, the bush, and the tree layers. When you think of fruit, ignore your grocery store background and start exploring what grows naturally in your bioregion. You may already have some food sources such as oaks, yuccas, or mesquites in your yard. When you choose your trees, go for the native or well-adapted seedlings that will produce with the least amount of water, fertilization, and attention. And since you are exploring unknown territory, be prepared to make a lot of mistakes.